Good day, everyone! Londononion here, finally returning with yet another build for our heavy weapon wielding engineer. Forgive the delay in our rhythm of posting, but you know, life happens. And this onion will be introducing an alternative format of our build exposition, with a two-part series and a slightly deeper dive into build efficacy. Accompanying the engineer today will be the close quarters combat specialist, the Challenger. First, we'll have a thorough exposition of the build, apply it to our archetype matrix, and discuss part 1 of our application and limitations with a biome evaluation. Here we go. So for this build, I go with a heavy armor set, particularly the Leto Mark II. This is not prescriptive, but simply to maximize armor potential. The relic I go with is the Shielded Heart, which grants a 100% shield for 20 seconds. Moving on to our main weapons, the primary I equip is the Chicago Typewriter. The mod is open to preference, but I enjoy the effects of Scrapshot, given the nature of this build, which we will get into later on. Space Crabs are a close second though. As for the Mutator, I go with Twisting Wounds for a boost to range damage against bleeding targets, and allows the weapon to apply bleeding for a 20-second period. The secondary I equip is the Nebula, which comes with Nanoswarm. The Mutator I use on this one is Kill Switch for a radial explosive result upon switching to the weapon. The cooldown is reduced based on the number of targets eliminated by the blast. Now, the melee weapon is also a preferential choice, but this onion prefers something with an elemental effect. Smolder, Krell Axe, and the Huntress Spear are viable options, but for the purposes of versatility, I decided to stick with Krell Axe with Shielded Strike. Melee strikes, or throwing the axe, or a charged attack of any other weapon, will grant a 6% shield and stack 5 times for 5 seconds. Charged melee damage is also increased based on shield accumulation. With our main weapons out of the way, we'll transition to our fashionable accessories. The amulet leading this build is the Cost of Betrayal, which reduces one's relic charges to 1 and increases all damage by 25% while the relic is present. Upon use, incoming damage is increased by 25% for 15 seconds. After the elapsed time, 1 relic charge will be granted back. The accompanying rings are Ring of Ordnance, Black Spinel, Generating Band, and Detonating Cord. 2 alternatives would be the Blessed Ring and Celerity Stone. Ring of Ordnance allows one's heavy weapon to regenerate at 75% of its normal rate while deployed. When stowed away, regeneration rate is doubled. Black Spinel replenishes 2% of one's health per second for 3 seconds. Duration is increased by 1.5 seconds when refreshing a negative status effect and maximizes at 15 seconds. Compounding with this, Generating Band grants 3% health per second while a shield is active. Lastly, Detonating Cord creates a radial explosion upon relic use and increases explosive damage by 10% for 15 seconds. Now for the skills, on the Engineer, I employ the Flamethrower, and for the Challenger, I go with Juggernaut for a boost in defense and melee prowess. Moving on to the traits, I steal the Medic's Triage, then Vigor, Endurance, Expertise, Amplitude, Bark Skin, Recovery, Shade Skin, and Siphoner. To top off this build, I reuse the same prism from our Vampiric Vulcan, but equip cast speed, consumable use speed, and skill damage. Attached to the prism is casting speed, skill damage, health regeneration, range damage, and skill duration. With the build ascertained, we'll move on to the designative process. So as of late, I make use of a personally constructed archetype matrix to help illustrate the main function of a given build, and show some of the thought process behind their construction. The left and right vertices act as poles of measurement for the dominant combat method, while the north and south poles are modifiers. Lastly, the lines act as ranked designative traits that are present to varying degrees. For the purpose of consistency, Predators will be defined as close quarters and/or melee-oriented builds, with a reactive, blitzkrieg-like answer to enemy encounters. Tacticians will be defined as range-oriented builds, with a proactive, attritional answer to enemy encounters. Specializations refine the main offensive method for optimized carnage and execution. Naturally, such builds are narrow in attack pattern, and may struggle in a number of circumstances that aren't conducive to the highlighted offensive method. However, they are unparalleled when successfully executed. Dynamos diversify offensive/defensive avenues for having an answer to a wide range of enemies/circumstances. Such builds may give way to overly convoluted/segmented operation, or inhibited offense due to a lack of simplified capitalization, but will rarely be left without an effective answer. To determine the designation, we'll look at our evaluation of function. The more nuanced our evaluation, the more dynamic the build is. The more lopsided, the more specialized it is. Each category exists on a spectrum. Higher subcategories are of greater importance and carry more weight toward a function. Lower subcategories have less weight, but are still worth consideration. Starting with offensive capability, highest on the tier list is the greatest and most frequent damage numbers. This one easily goes to the engineer heavy weapon while in heavy carry mode. Now this onion would consider the flamethrower to be a close quarters weapon, putting significant weight on the predator pole, but there is still more to consider. Moving on to ease of use, this onion would argue that neither of the weapons are particularly difficult or require major adjustment. However, the Chicago typewriter takes a small win since there is no projectile speed, but hit scan instead. Additionally, the typewriter becomes easier to use as one continues to fire as the crosshairs become tighter for further range targets. Nebula and the flamethrower are limited in their range, and hit detection can sometimes be tricky depending on the profile of a given enemy and whether they are airborne. Moving on to practicality or applicability, the flamethrower, both in turret and heavy carry mode, cover the bases of mid-range and close-range combat, with a bonus of burning damage. It's important to note, though, that turret mode can be hazardous to the caster if one is too close to enemies. Heavy carry also allows one to scorch all targets within a cone of close range. Naturally, one will be slower and maneuverability somewhat compromised. Nebula has a similar damage function, but the numbers are not nearly as high, though with the help of the Nanoswarm mod, damage numbers are dramatically increased, and this will work for all profiles of enemies. The typewriter is generally useful, but is best reserved for mid to far range. Krell Axe can be used in place of the flamethrower or Nebula, but this onion prefers to use it mainly for throwing purposes, as it is not particularly powerful up close. So practicality is an all-way tie, as each offensive constituent has its role based on circumstances. Moving on to restorative/defensive capability, starting off with health restoration. Every one of our weapons has an elemental/negative status effect, and because of the dark spinel ring, health will be restored where there is offense. The Krell Axe, however, is the only weapon that activates both the dark spinel and the generating band, putting it in the lead for health restoration. Even though it can be thrown, I would still say that its chief use is for close range, giving significant weight to the predator side. But everything has restorative capability, so it is still a somewhat nuanced victory. Moving on to shields, aside from the relic, only the Krell Axe has shield activation, though to a small degree. Technically, the heavy weapon Gunbuck will also grant a shield and pack quite a punch, though this is less frequently used. As for damage reduction, this comes from Bulwark stacks offered by the Challenger Juggernaut skill and Relic perk upon consumption while within close range of enemies. Otherwise, the Engineer's Magnetic Field grants 15% damage reduction while in carry mode or while within close range. Amplitude makes Magnetic Field easier to activate while in turret mode. This onion would give this a slight predator victory since the flamethrower is primarily for close range purposes, while turret mode is treated more as a secondary option, but we'll speak more on that a bit later. Alright, moving on to synergy, starting with the Amulet and Rings. The Amulet is a buff to all damage, which would then buff our highest damaging weapon, that being the Engineer Flamethrower. Ring of Ordnance is also exclusive to the heavy weapon. Dark Spinel affects the flamethrower and everything else. Generating Band specifically benefits the Krell Axe and the Relic. Lastly, Detonating Cord enhances explosive damage, which benefits the flamethrower while in turret mode. Everything else, though, would suffer a complete 25% debuff of damage, so the flamethrower again takes a victory. Looking at the fragments and prism enhancements, this does not require meticulous evaluation, as most constituents are tailored to skill augmentation. most notably the Engineer's Flamethrower, with some small enhancement given to range damage, but this is not nearly as impactful. As for skill enhancements, both the Engineer and Challenger's skill setting are conducive to a close quarters end. The main specialty is with the Flamethrower, but that is not to say that there are no tactician strengths, but this build definitely hugs the Predator pole. However, the variability in subcategory strengths is varied enough that this onion would struggle to call it a juggernaut, but instead a dynamic fighter with a flamethrower specializing tendency. Fighters prioritize melee/close range combat with supplemental far-ranged and proactive ability. Fighters, though close to the dynamic pole, don't necessarily engage in combat on their back foot, like their kiter counterparts. Aggression is their shtick, but high damage numbers and defense come from a compounded effort of various tools, and this will transition us to a discussion on how this build is intended to function in conjunction with our personally constructed biome evaluation. So our biome evaluation will take place across 3 fronts: crowds, elites, and biome topography. For specificity, we will be discussing Yaesha, Losomn, and Nerude. It's important to note that our discussion on efficacy and enemy profiles will be more of a summative synthesis, and not be exhaustive of all enemy types and zones, but will speak on the ones that have the most significance. First, however, we'll have a brief discussion on how this elemental exterminator is intended to be used. As a fighter type, this build is inherently dynamic and aggressive, particularly with close range capability. There are 2 modes of offense that can be employed depending on circumstances. The primary mode is holding the Engineer's Flamethrower in hand. This will have an immediate healing effect with Black Spinel, and most weak enemies will be eliminated quickly. The only time this healing effect fails is when enemies are in water, but the efficiency is still comparable. Generally, the Flamethrower is best used in the face of grouped enemies, or fewer tough targets that aren't evasive. Due to Ring of Ordnance, the Flamethrower can withstand regular use and will also allow one's main weapons to replenish ammo more consistently, which will transition us into the second mode of combat, which will allow a more dynamic use of one's tools. This onion will refer to this as Mode 2 for short. In this mode, the heavy weapon is stationary and provides supplemental damage to one's main weapons. This mode is convenient, but comes with the potential for friendly fire if close to enemies. The pros outweigh the cons in this onion's opinion, but its deployment still requires some discretion, lest one's demise come from their own hand. The typewriter is one's best bet for far and mid-range shooting. The Twisting Wounds Mutator and Scrapshot mod allow it to add stacks of healing due to the bleeding effect. Now, this weapon is not the most powerful, but allows one to kite their enemies where there is a need. If enemies get too close for comfort, switching to Nebula is an appropriate option, as it mimics the Flamethrower. Part of the effectiveness of Nebula as a backup weapon is Kill Switch, which will create some breathing room and eliminate most weak targets and stagger tougher variants. Elites may or may not be staggered from the blast. Plus, its Nano Swarm provides a perfect answer to surrounding close targets. Speaking of explosive contingencies, Detonating Cord has a similar effect upon using a relic as a balance to the vulnerability. Now, relic use does fly in the face of our amulet, but is a useful and somewhat necessary caveat to using the secondary mode. The Flamethrower turret expends its reserves rather quickly. Upon depletion, one can use a relic and immediately redeploy, and rinse and repeat as needed. This is also an appropriate response to critical health. Due to the Challenger's relic perk, one will gain 2 stacks of Bulwark when close to enemies upon use. It would then be appropriate to activate Juggernaut for maximized stacks, which will counteract the amulet drawbacks. Additionally, one will gain a 100% shield, and their health will regenerate much faster due to generating band and issued elemental damage. The Krell Axe is the most unique, as it can heal with both shield activation and elemental damage, though it must be thrown for this to take place. It is important to state that when thrown, this weapon will stagger most weak and tough profiles, so mixing it in with the secondary offensive combat is worthwhile, especially as a quick way to gain back significant health. There will, however, be a higher demand on precision and timing. Moving on to our biome evaluation, starting off with Yaesha. On the spectrum of topography, This one hugs the varied middle ground of spacious and cramped. Off-beaten paths, however, tend to be more polarized. Floating jungle zones are more on the spacious side, while tombs tend to have a crampy layout. Due to the nature of our elemental exterminator, spacious zones will discourage regular use of the flamethrower in heavy carry mode, aka the strongest offensive method, and as a corollary encourage use of mode 2. Enemies in these zones tend to be homogeneous with root flyers / empowered flyers, and these guys are easily dealt with. They may have projectiles, but they are slow and easy to dodge. With that said, using the flamethrower is still a viable option amongst these enemies, since they like to get close as well. The only elites worth worrying about in these zones are the Empowered Slayer, since their teleportation makes flamethrower use unnecessarily difficult, and the Lamir Apostate, because of their periodic overhead beam strikes. But the other offensive methods, like Nebula's Nanoswarm or the stationary flamethrower, make their encounters easier, even if there are other enemies present. Now the jungles and tombs bear greater challenges. However, it is important to note that the tombs are more cramped, while the jungles are more spacious. In the jungles, the most annoying enemies are by far the tumblers and root moths, especially when attacking together. This is most notable in the far woods. One is airborne and the other is grounded, while both are relatively fast. Unless they are grouped, using the flamethrower leaves one in a terribly vulnerable state. It's not impossible, but the risks are far higher. This gets even more difficult during a crescendo that involves an elite in the mixture. Since this is a dynamic build, effective tools for offense and defense / restoration are easily accessed. Root Nexus, a crescendo event in this onion's opinion, will test the elemental exterminator's ability to manage multiple enemy profiles and elites at the same time. Generally, Mode 2 is most useful unless enemies are conveniently grouped or lined up. Tombs offer a more homogeneous enemy saturation of root zombies and rotworts, but the saturation is heavier due to the relatively cramped space. The root shaman is particularly threatening if not dealt with quickly. It can endlessly respawn root zombies that explode upon defeat. These zones are also where the flamethrower shines the most, as virtually every enemy prioritizes melee offensive patterns. As a fighter, close range is the elemental exterminator's element, but the main risk is surprise, especially with an elite like the Root Hulk. The aberration version, Rot, can also be rather challenging due to the space he is encountered in, but as long as one keeps the elemental pressure, health should not be an issue. Mode 2 is the most ideal means of taking on this aberration, as it is easy to get cornered with his long reach or ambushed from his thrown projectiles. Mutators can make a massive difference in this fight. In this role, cubes were the trump card and demanded a more frequent use of relics due to this onion taking on damage, but attrition is the answer with this one. One other noteworthy aberration battle is the Weldstalker and Gnarled Archer. Mode 2 is a necessity with these two. The mutators weren't terrible in this role, but quite annoying. Their main challenge is attention-splitting offense, and their agility doesn't help either. They are the perfect kiters to our fighter, but having a constant rotation of the various tools and skills was the key to victory. Other, less fortunate roles had the Shocking Mutator, which was even more difficult and demanded more timing with evasions. Mode 1 offense, though, is a no-go. Zones like Indera's End and Kayula's Rest are the only spacious indoor areas, and harbor root snipers. This is one of those areas where the typewriter is one's best choice of offense, unless one gets lucky with a close encounter. Mode 2 is the most advantageous option, since these guys are naturally flighty and will demand a kiting response to their own kiting efforts. One last aberration worth mentioning is the Protector of the Grove. This one was particularly frustrating due to their speed and devastation. The other doe that appear without warning can disrupt one's cadence in taking it on. And I don't know about the rest of you, but random animals in the environment are annoyingly devastating. In this role, the Protector came with sand guards, and the most efficient means of getting rid of them was with Kill Switch. The rest of the battle is straightforward, though time for adequate recovery is slim. The one gauntlet in Yaesha is in the Chimney, where enemies are essentially endless, and the elites numerous upon reaching the second half. Stalkers can be troublesome since they clone themselves after reaching low health, but they teleport first and are invulnerable during the teleporting phase. They will then begin to heal quickly. The teleporting is the annoying part since the flamethrower is a short-range weapon. But otherwise, these guys aren't too big of a deal. Moving on to Losomn. This one tends to have more crampy zones, with some pockets of spacious areas. This automatically translates to a more advantageous offensive position. The Dran are typically a breeze, since a good portion of them will be briefly stunned from the flames. The main threat is those with guns, but overall, places like Ironburrow and Brockwith Quarter are simple. This changes slightly in places like Cotton's Kiln or Butcher's Quarter, with Oil Dran since fire won't do much against them. Any other weapon, however, is perfectly fine. The Butcher's Quarter optional crescendo can present some challenges, specifically if one does not have their turret deployed. Timing the overclocked prime perk and using the relic reset is paramount to success. When done correctly, the turret will last considerably longer and reduce the odds of being blindsided. As for the Dran that approach with torches, the fastest means of staggering targets is with the kill switch mutator, which will at the very least knock them down if not eliminate them immediately. The only time the heavy carry is used is when initiating the battle with the spectating crowd. Otherwise, deploying the turret on the stage is one's best bet for full coverage. Stepping away from the Dran a little bit, the Fae are an annoying bunch, since they can commonly be encountered as mixed grounded and airborne profiles. Grounded foes can be handled with the flamethrower, but airborne foes are not so simple. Plus, both profiles are quite agile and are dangerous in larger numbers. Staying mobile with the flamethrower in turret mode is advised for maximum success, but if they can be bottlenecked, then the heavy carry is viable. This can be most notable in the Great Hall Crescendo event with Fae soldiers and elites. Now when the flamethrower is in turret mode, even with Ring of Ordnance, it does not last particularly long. A strategy this onion likes to employ is using relics to modestly extend its deployment, or dramatically accelerate its cooldown for quick redeployment. During this particular crescendo, this strategy falls flat, and one will have to rely more heavily on the other offensive methods. Using the Krell Axe for shields and consequent health boosts is an option, though accuracy, especially with airborne Fae, is a challenge. At least it is for this onion. Using the relic is a common strategy this onion employs throughout the different biomes, but it is important to state that it cannot be abused with bosses or aberrations that have the empathy mutator, unless there is an emergency of course, but that will be covered in the second part of this build evaluation. A somewhat similar limitation that was noted with Yaesha takes place in the sewers of Losomn. Taking on enemies with a flamethrower while in water eliminates the status effect completely. At the same time though, I wouldn't consider this to be a massive loss in damage numbers, especially when supplementation can be achieved with alternative weapons, including the typewriter. Speaking of the sewers, Barghest the Vile, a noteworthy aberration, is a perfect example of this limitation. Luckily, there are pockets of solid ground that allow one to build stacks for the Black Spinel. Generally, this aberration is not terribly difficult, but this one is also mutator specific. Now there was no elemental resistance, cubes of death, or shocking, so the flames from the heavy carry sap his health quickly. Outside of the main target, a significant threat is the luminescent bloaters, which lobs electrical projectiles and inflicts overloaded. Alright, moving on to Nerud. The main fields of Nerud are spacious and wide, however the off-beaten paths are more enclosed or narrow, which for this build is not necessarily bad. Battle drones, which are mainly prevalent in one of the main fields, are not conducive to using our strongest offensive method, but they aren't difficult to defeat either. Their numbers though can make them somewhat overwhelming. Most foes throughout Nerud have easy answers to their challenges. Nerud zombies are easily burned away, even with mixed profiles. They are somewhat slow, and stumble with ease in their own suppression puddles. The possessed zombies are annoying at most, but aren't terribly devastating. The typewriter is an ideal choice against these guys. All of the different types of parasites easily succumb to the flamethrower as well, especially since they mainly prefer to invade personal space. Parasite spitters though can be devastating if one is not attentive. Nanoswarm, Kill Switch, and Scrapshot do well against these foes, as they tend to be numerous and overwhelming. Their zones also tend to be cramped, which is ideal for this build, but comes with its drawbacks of high enemy saturation. As far as elites go, Cloaked drone carriers have the greatest probability of being problematic, since they immediately cloak and evade if one gets too close. Time in combat with them may be longer, but their drones are quickly eliminated with either nanoswarm or kill switch. The flamethrower in turret mode can also do a great deal of damage. Now, one of the greatest weaknesses of this build is the lack of staggering capability. Enemies can walk through the flamethrower, nebula, and the typewriter with ease. At most, kill switch, detonating cord, and potentially Krell axe can help with this, but they can only be used so frequently. So although this build functions on aggression, the only real way to remain steadfast is with the Juggernaut skill, though this onion prefers to reserve this skill for damage reduction over walking through an enemy's onslaught. Despite our armor and healing capability, this cannot be abused, and one should take care to give time for proper recovery. There are 3 gauntlets in Narud, and this onion would consider Terminus Station to be the most dangerous, especially since it is a timed event. The enemy profiles mainly consist of robot grunts, shield bearers, and specters. They aren't difficult, but they will easily walk through attacks and naturally crowd our elemental exterminator. Scrapshot and kill switch will have to become a regular use for adequate defense and efficient enemy elimination. Both modes of offense are doable and come down to personal preference. At the end is a shielded drone carrier which can be taken out with the flamethrower, provided one understands the attack patterns. To aid with the tiny drones, this onion would recommend Mode 2 for a mixture of offense and defense, specifically with kill switch, and have access to Krell axe for a boost in regeneration. The end can be quite saturated and inherently attention splitting, though because of its enclosed space, friendly fire will have a greater likelihood of occurrence. So overall, as far as this onion's experience goes with our elemental exterminator, Yaesha was easily the most frustrating, while Losomn and Narud were relatively easy to deal with. As a general limitation that can be noted throughout the biomes, not all elements are equally effective. Some enemies, for example, don't bleed or cannot be corroded, so adaptation is necessary, though this can be framed as a strength as well, since virtually everything is at our disposal. But this is only one half of our assessment of this build. In our next installment, we'll be taking a more complete dive into boss efficacy. Otherwise though, it's been Londononion, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.